Hello, I'm Shihoko Goto, the director of the Indo-Pacific program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all very much for joining us today. From EVs to laptops to defense systems, it's clear that the demand for advanced technology is only accelerating. And with it, the demand for the components that make the technology possible continues to accelerate as well. Now, Taiwan's role in producing the world's most advanced semiconductors is very well known, and there is great awareness that a blow to Taiwan's chip manufacturing capabilities will devastate the global economy and not just the Taiwanese economy. And as such, Taiwan's continued economic resilience is in the interest of the world economy. But how does Taiwan fare when it comes to securing critical minerals? Can it withstand the global competition to secure rare earths and critical minerals amid heightened geopolitical tensions? There are many questions, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Ling-Tuan Liu to discuss this issue with us today. She is a policy analyst with the Division of Defense Strategy and Resources at Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research, INDSR. And I'm very happy to say that she is also the seventh Taiwan scholar here at the Wilson Center, and she spent this summer with us in Washington to conduct her research on Taiwan's role in the global competition for critical minerals. And also joining us today is my friend and former colleague, Duncan Wood, who is now the president and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy based in Los Angeles. Previously, he was the vice president for strategy and new initiatives at the Wilson Center, where he focused, amongst many issues, on supply chain resiliency and critical minerals. So let me first turn to you, Linda. You're with INDSR, a leading defense think tank in Taiwan. Why choose this topic? Where did you go? What led you to focus on this, and what kind of key findings did you come up with?
Thank you so much, Shihoko and Duncan. I'm just so grateful to be with Wilson Center this past summer and also being able to meet experts across DC and here in Taiwan as well for their great insights and altogether made my research possible. I chose this topic because last year, China's series of export bans on critical minerals has actually prompted many countries, including the US and Taiwan, to be aware of the possible supply chain disruption and thus work harder to stockade their own resources or enhance cooperation with other nations. And as China seems to be the key player or even the dominating one in some of the critical minerals, for example, the mining, refining, and processing of rare earth elements, I'm just curious about how will future bans like these impact the patterns of the global supply chain of critical minerals. And also, China's actions might seem dominating from the outside, but I'm also curious about what are the actual takes from its own mineral experts? What influence do they think these domestic policies would have on their own rare earth industry? And then I want to find out what these views mean to the US-led supply chain, and moreover, how Taiwan, which sits at the exact center of the US-China competition geopolitically, could do for itself when facing similar supply chain challenges like these, and even contribute to the more resilient supply chain globally. Yeah. And so to find out more about these questions, I first looked through some of the domestic discussions from the rare earth experts in China and realized there exists some interesting aspects regarding China's strict intervention or control on its rare earth resources. Here, I would just like to highlight some of my findings. First, I think in the near term, China is expected to roll out more export bans on raw and processed critical minerals and on technology sharing as part of its foreign policy goals. However, these bans may not be long lasting as they will not only affect China's targeted countries, but they will also directly hinder its own export outflow, which then will exacerbate the overcapacity problem of their own critical minerals. In my research case, it's the rare earth industry. And there are vulnerabilities and limitations existing in China's export bans. The PRC's overregulation and over-weaponizing of these rare earth resources have led to market distortion and has also prevented the Chinese rare earth industry to upscale. China's excessive weaponization of resources has shown its lack of accurate understanding about how the rare earth industries actually function. So China's state media aggravates this situation further still by providing inaccurate information. One major misunderstanding is China's claim that it only has 23% of the global rare earth reserve, making it very difficult to bear the burden of providing more than 90% of the global rare earth needs. And thus, China's own reserves are declining. Well, in reality, this misunderstanding has neglected the fact that China itself actually accounts more than 60% of the global rare earth demands. And by only emphasizing China's exhausting supply role, these sorts of image have produced a myth to the Chinese public that the West is taking advantage of China's cheap environmental and labor costs, causing China's rare earths sold at a cheap cabbage price. So Chinese state media has then mistakenly formed its own propaganda of the so-called safeguarding China's strategic and precious rare earth resources from outflowing to other countries, which not only affect how the Chinese public perceives the topic, but also serve as a policymaking uh, tone of the Chinese government, prompting the government to impose export bans, industry controls, and reserves on its rare earth products. However, the key to the advancement and prosperity of the rare earth industry lies in the promotion of the industry's lower end application, which include functional materials applied in areas such as permanent magnets, luminescence, catalysts, and hydrogen storage, rather than the mining, refining, and upstream processing. And many of these lower end advanced technology associated with rare earth functional materials have actually been seized by countries such as Japan, Korea, US, and the EU. So China still has a great gap to catch up. This China's measure has such as export bans and reserve mechanisms on rare earth upstream products have appeared to be, I would say, cart before the horse policy direction. And this wrong policy direction that China has held to over the years um, involves measures such as export amounts, reserves, directive production plans, etc., uh, all of which carry some level of detrimental effects on its own rare earth industry development. Um, I would just stop here just to, yeah, for some feedback, or I can go further for some of the examples regarding Chinese export experts discussion on its these vulnerabilities, but I would stop here just for some feedback. Yeah, thanks.
No, great. Thank you so much, Linda, for starting us off here. You made some really interesting points, and I think there are two that stood out to me in particular. One is essentially that China is shooting itself in the foot, that export controls could actually be good for it in the near term, but in the longer term, it actually leads to market distortion, which ultimately hurts the Chinese economy. And the second point that you made was also very interesting about essentially disinformation, so that this narrative of China being exploited and that it is being put in a vulnerable position because it is being forced to be the cheap provider of rare earths to the global market when in fact the demand is largely from within its own borders. Thought that was an interesting part in the broader scheme of things. But let me now turn to Duncan. Duncan, you've written extensively about supply chain resiliency, but your focus has usually been on the US supply chain, right? And here we are, we're looking at it initially from the Taiwan perspective. And Taiwan is geopolitically vulnerable and also has challenges to enhancing its own critical mineral supply chain resiliency. I'm hoping that you might shed some light on what you found particularly interesting about some of Linda's findings and how this. Let me turn to you. Like, what was particularly striking to you?
Thanks, Shihoko, and thank you, Linda. I was very excited when I spoke to Linda, first of all, about this paper because it really does add to our understanding in Washington. All too often, the work on supply chains has focused almost exclusively on the United States and a small number of allies. That's not just true of critical mineral supply chains, it's true of our supply chain policies in general. And so I would say that this paper really adds to our understanding of the critical minerals supply chain globally, but also of supply chains in general. And I would say that one of the weaknesses, not just of the analysis that takes place in Washington, but actually of US supply chain policy in general, is that we have tended to focus exclusively on what it means for us here at home. We haven't understood the impact, both positive and negative, on our allies overseas. And I think that's was seen very clearly with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the really quite extraordinary reactions that we got from the Koreans, the Japanese, the Europeans, etc. Sort of a hand-wringing, hair-pulling kind of like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? But I think more generally, we've only seen limited efforts in the supply chain space to try to coordinate the global supply chain. And the reason why that matters is because supply chains are global. These are not things that happen within national borders. There are many different components. And as everybody knows, semiconductors are one of the most globally traded commodities. The supply chain for them is complex, many different components crossing national borders. So that's the first thing. I think that what Linda's managed to do here is to really add a level of complexity to our understanding, which is really, really important, and to understand the impact of the geopolitical changes that we're seeing in supply chains on an important key ally like Taiwan. It's also very, very interesting in adding that extra dimension, as you said, Shihoko, about the impact of Chinese export controls on Chinese businesses and on Chinese industry in general. Here in the United States, we have had supply chain policy that has been driven by two main concerns. One is sort of the national security component and trying to reduce our vulnerability on China. The other one has been from the private sector itself. In the IRA, in the Defense Production Act, there has been extensive consultation with the private sector to understand the impact of changes in supply chain policy on the private sector. It hasn't always been successful. It hasn't always been accurate. In fact, in the United States, those same actors who have argued for less reliance on China have later on come back to say, actually, we can't survive without the Chinese. And so, there's an evolutionary element here. But I think that what Linda's managed to do is to add something to our conversation, which is to say that as China tries to react to US moves and tries to get ahead of the United States in the supply chain competition, there are immediate and far-reaching consequences for Chinese industry. And that's particularly important at this point in the economic cycle for China, where the economy is not doing as well as it has been doing for decades. The third point that I'd like to make is something that it's a recent paper that's come out from CSIS called "From Mine to Microchip" by Gracelyn Bascarin and Meredith Schwartz, which is a terrific paper which looks at all the different components of semiconductors in terms of the critical mineral supply chain. And it really understands or it provides insights into how dependent we are on China, not just for rare earths, not just for silicon wafers, etc., but really in terms of the gallium and germanium side of things. And gallium, for example, a great example there, which is that gallium is a byproduct of bauxite mining. So you think about where aluminium, as I would say, or aluminum, as Americans would say, is being processed in the world. Overwhelmingly, it's being processed in China. So something like aluminum, which we consider to be sort of, ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's in our kitchen drawers, doesn't seem to be a critical mineral at all. it's connected to the critical mineral supply chain and connected to gallium in a meaningful way. And so, that element of it, and particularly the part about processing of minerals in general, this is something that we see across the board with the critical mineral supply chain. We've got to bring more capacity for processing out of China and into the United States and allied nations. It's much more important than the extraction itself of the basic mineral from the earth. And the last point that I'll make is, in terms of the contribution of this paper, is really the dynamic between China and the United States. As China has exposed US vulnerability in supply chains in general, the United States seeks to diversify. As the United States seeks to diversify, there are hopefully going to be more options for Taiwan. And I'll just refer back to that point about processing. If we can build processing capacity outside of China, that will be a very positive thing for Taiwan because it gives them options. But at the same time, we're seeing a deepening of the breach in supply chains. We've talked at length in the past about how a lot of US companies are now creating separate supply chains for their market in China versus their market in North America and the rest of the world. And I think that the Chinese themselves are going through that same process, and it's not immediate. It's not something which is sort of you flick a switch and all of a sudden you have two supply chains, but it's a gradual process. And the more that we get into this kind of tit for tat, and the export controls from China, retaliation from the United States, diversification from the United States, we're beginning to see that breach is growing. And increasingly, we're hearing in the public discourse about the dangers of separating the US and Chinese economies, not just in terms of the worsening of the overall bilateral relationship, but really in terms of that point that I made earlier on, which is that a lot of US companies are now struggling to remain competitive without the basic components that are coming from China. And even if we do diversify processing and refining of critical minerals, that may not be as competitive as what China has already got going.
Thank you, Duncan. Don't know, Linda, if you want to immediately answer some of the issues that Duncan raised, but if I may start off with one of the topics that Duncan raised, which is about coordination and cooperation, the challenge of de-risking from China. There is a global understanding amongst the advanced economies that China, depending too heavily on China, is risky business, and that this is not just for critical minerals, but it just goes throughout. However, there are different variations, gradations of how we assess that China challenge. For the United States, the China challenge is a systemic threat. And so we've stopped talking about decoupling, but there is this whole idea of small yard, high fence. How do we protect and promote US domestic competitiveness and vis-a-vis China? Is there a shared understanding amongst Taiwan and some of the key partners and allies that Taiwan looks to, including the United States, Japan, Australia, and the like? And is there opportunity for greater coordination when it comes to critical mineral supply chain resiliency?
Well, thank you, Shihoko, for the question, and also Duncan for the comments. I think I just want to point out that actually there are some bilateral cooperation either between the US and some like Japan or Australia or Taiwan. Because right now it's very difficult for Taiwan to join any of the major like the mineral security alliances. I think there's none of them that Taiwan is there. So I think one of the practical ways for Taiwan in the short term would be try to use these sorts of already built existing bilateral relationship with countries like Japan, Australia, and US, Canada, and maybe expand more, and then further make it as a mini-lateral one so that, we, of course, we cannot be present in the any kind of mining partnership, but at least these sorts of incremental way would be more practical than, just, one step going to that mining partnerships. So that's just my take on that. Yeah.
Xiaoko, if I may, I think that's a really important point, which is that because of Taiwan's international status, it's different, right? I mean, we can't deal with Taiwan in the same way as we deal with the European Union, with the Brits, with the Australians, etc. And so finding a way to accommodate them into the conversations over global supply chains in general, I think is really, really important. And maybe, and you know this much better than I do, Shihoko, but maybe through some of the emerging institutional frameworks in the Indo-Pacific, there's a way to address that.
Thank you, and I do think there are opportunities to not only engage Taiwan in an international framework, but certainly this raises even further awareness and the need to work around Taiwan's very unique international status as well. Maybe, Duncan, if I can turn to you and ask you to elaborate a little bit more about the challenge that the private sector has, so that we see this here in Washington largely through a prism of strategic competition. It's at the state to state level. But when we talk to companies that are engaged in the actual mining, in the actual distribution, that competition actually becomes a great hindrance. Are there opportunities for American companies to work with their Taiwanese, not necessarily counterparts, but partners, to enhance resiliency? And where are if we were to kind of see this in a private sector coordination cooperation network, where are the opportunities for both Taiwanese and American companies?
So, I mean, I think it's a really important question. And number one, I'll turn to the fact that, Taiwanese companies have been investing heavily in the United States, within US territory now for a number of years and building up their capacity there. That's important not just for the resilience of the supply chain, but obviously for political purposes as well and maintaining those positive relations. But secondly, I'll point to, an old hobby horse of mine, which is North America. The potential for building out the supply chains within the North American region, I think, is extensive. And what can be offered in Canada and the United States is quite different to what can be offered in Mexico, for example. So we're seeing a gradual process now whereby capacity in Mexico for for critical minerals processing, but more importantly for the semiconductor industry, is really developing over time. But we're beginning from a pretty low level. Really what we're seeing going on right now is some basic investment in packaging for semiconductors. Not that that isn't important; it does provide greater resilience, but it's not hitting at the heart of the problem. And things like workforce development in the semiconductor industry. All of that is really, really important for the long-term health of the semiconductor supply chain. But as we published a paper a couple of years ago at the Wilson Center with the rather unique title of Swans and Rhinos, which was looking at the over-the-horizon challenges in the semiconductor industry, and alongside things like sort of natural disasters and climate change, environment, etc. The building out of the workforce was a critical one. But these are long-term issues, and I think that's what we're seeing in the United States, in North America, and in allies in general, which is that this takes a tremendous amount of time. You make that decision to build out the supply chain. You make that decision that you're going to sort of address different aspects of it. But it takes years and years and years for these investments to come to fruition. And in the meantime, we're all still dependent upon Taiwan for certain kinds of semiconductors. We're dependent on China for other kinds of semiconductors. We're heavily dependent still on China for the critical minerals components. And the point that I always go back to when I'm talking about critical minerals in general is that when we first started looking at the critical mineral supply chain back in 2020, 2021, at the Wilson Center, we looked at the heavy dependence on China, not just for the extraction, but more importantly for the processing and refining of critical minerals. 3.5 years later, the situation is worse. In all the time that we've been investing enormous amounts of money in this and enormous amounts of political capital, and of course the Inflation Reduction Act, the DPA, etc., the Chinese have just simply been building out capacity. And they've been capturing the market. They've been capturing the supplies. They've been building out extraction in Africa and Latin America. And so the United States, 3.5 years later, is even more vulnerable than it was back then. And that's not to say that in 3 years from now that will be the case, because as I said, these are long-term investments. But we have to be really patient. And as I always say, and in particular, immediately after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, there's a tendency in the United States to say, hey, we threw billions of dollars at this, problem solved. And it's not. The goalposts are constantly moving. And here in the United States, we need to do an annual review of where we are in supply chain policy in general, critical minerals and semiconductors in particular, to say, how can we make incremental moves? What is the IRA 2.0? What is the CHIPS Act 2.0? How do we actually build in more of a critical minerals component into what happens next in terms of chips policy in the United States? Because it was largely absent from the CHIPS Act that went through a couple of years ago. Now we're understanding that this issue that Linda has raised is fundamentally important for the health of the industry.
So obviously, political will makes a huge difference. And I think we have this acknowledgement of the problem, but at the same time, we need to move forward from there. Linda, I'd like to turn to you to get your feedback on what Duncan has said, but also perhaps to discuss a little bit about Taiwan's own political will and how much public appetite there is to enhance investments.
Sure. And just think that I'm very confident that Taiwan do have the capacity to really fill in that technology cooperation gap. It's just that right now it seems to me that the investment and there are some limitations such as the insufficient investment and sometimes, for example, the rare earth industry in Taiwan, it's relatively small. So how to really make it to the bigger scale would be another problem. But that doesn't mean that Taiwan will not have the capacity to work with, like US or other countries. It's just, relatively small. But, again, I mean, we also need those materials for not only the green technologies, but also the semiconductor one. And last year's export ban does not really hit the very core of the Taiwan's need for the semiconductor, some of the semiconductor products, but definitely some of the people are worrying about like what if in the future, what if the China would they would pretty much upscale that export bans to the next level. But I just want to kind of like bring in some very interesting sort of relationship between like Taiwan and China. So actually, despite the very toxic, the geopolitical toxic problem now on the surface, actually some of the experts, across strait, they are engaging for years on, the some of the processing or refining technology. So there has been good relationship. So it doesn't say that, oh, we are going to be decoupling from China and that we just, cut all the connection. I don't think that would be a good way to process further. But I think what Taiwan can do is trying to work on both sides. So right now we can keep on working on the expanding all the relationship, to the US-led supply chain. But on the other hand, I think the connection with some of the Chinese expertise and technology is also very important. And for these past decade, actually, there has been some good exchange efforts across strait on this particular rare earth industry. Is just very low key, so they tend to be just maintaining a very low profile sort of activity. But right now the challenge is really the increasing hampering from the Chinese government on these sorts of technology exchange or even export things like that. So right now the risk is that if our expertise people they want to visit China for that sort of exchange, they will probably be deemed as somebody who want to steal, technology, and or they could be facing the even jail or a problem like that. So there has been some very close cases happening in recent months. So people are kind of worried about that. But I guess um, it's undeniable that through these cross-strait sharing, technology-wise, academic-wise, that we can further, benefit both the rare earth industry. It's not just the Taiwan side, but also actually it also benefits the rare earth industry for China, even though they would probably not think about that this way. It's the experts internally from China actually talks about, it should be more, there should be more engagement with outer world on technology sharing so that the whole rare earth industry could be upscaled to the next level. Yeah, that's their development goal that the Chinese side need to work on. But I mean, going back from Duncan's comments on, this, the real, I think the problem is still there. Like we still lack of some of the capacity on the processing, the very upstream level. I think, yeah, I think there should be some efforts, between Taiwan and the States, in the United States, and like-minded partners and countries to work on how to really form like a platform, or promote more exchange or investment on these, so that these could not just only stay on this sort of a talking level, but to really upscale and to really have some effectiveness. So that's just my own take on that.
And Shihoko, if I can on that, I think that we need to understand here in the United States, and it may well be true in Taiwan as well, that perhaps we're going to have to pay a premium. So, we may not be able to get the basic critical minerals components in their refined or processed form at the same price as we'll get them from China. But we will have to, so we'll have to pay a little bit more, but there will be a, supply chain resilience or security premium that's being paid there. And this sounds great from the perspective of a think tank and talking about national security. When it comes to the private sector, and we've talked a lot about how the shift in thinking over supply chains and the building in of values, etc. But when push comes to shove, the shareholders say, why are we losing money on this? We don't understand. So there needs to be a conversation between the private sector and government to say, how do we engage in a burden sharing exercise here, so that the extra cost of buying our basic inputs from a source other than China is that we're going to pay more, but how do we split that cost? Because the United States, Taiwan governments are benefiting from that in terms of national security, and we can't expect all of that burden to fall on the private sector.
No, that's absolutely right. And I was actually thinking about an example of making lemonade out of lemons from the Japanese experience. So about a decade ago, Japan faced a export ban of rare earths from China in response to Japan's decision to nationalize the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands. What happened then was that Japan realized it was depending almost over 90% of its rare earths was coming from China. And so what they actually start partnering with Australia, investing in Australian mines. A decade on, dependence on China still remains foremost, but that dependency has been reduced to about 60% or thereabouts. And Australia's mining industry has boomed as a result of a public-private partnership between the Japanese government and the private sector to invest in Australia. Which brings me to think about new efforts for coordination and burden sharing. And we had talked about this in the semiconductor realm. There was this whole idea of a Chip 4 alliance between Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and the United States that hasn't really worked out well because of the competitive nature of the actual companies, especially between Taiwan and Korea. However, there is another way of looking at the critical mineral supply chain as well. And if there are ways to encourage that kind of investment and incentivize those types of cooperation, I think it could go a long way. Um, Linda, you talked about the China-Taiwan cooperation, especially at the working level, especially amongst researchers. I'm wondering whether, when we talk about alternative sources, right? So in the energy sphere, we have seen the rise of the decarbonization leading to new energy sources being developed. Um, are there any exploratory efforts to go beyond critical minerals at this stage? Are we kind of stuck with that and it becomes really about how we tolerate, environmental, how we define environmental sustainability, how do we burden share in terms of mining and the like? Or are there ways to come up with an alternative path?
Well, I guess in some of the discussions that I saw amongst the Chinese experts in the rare earth industry, they apparently know that the well, coming, I was just talking a little bit about further the question that we raised previously about Japan's example. So clearly, China knows that the 2010s, that sort of export ban pattern is not working. It's not working. It's not working towards the end goal that they want to really hamper Japan. But eventually Japan did get away with that, quite well. Yeah. So I think the alternative for the critical minerals that kind of links to the your questions about like is it that going to be critical all the time? Yes, I mean in the short term, yes, but for some elements that, the technology that apply in the green sector, sometimes it could it could change, they could use other minerals, they could find alternative materials that, that would definitely replace some of the criticality of the elements that are used. So one of the example was that the permanent magnets being some of the elements, rare earth elements used there because of some price hike or things like that, then it just ended up as those critical minerals that are not critical anymore for some time, that they are replaced by other elements. And so this is also discussed in some of the Chinese some of the Chinese experts. So I guess that was just give us some flowing thinking about how, the replaceability of some of the critical minerals. I think that's probably the alternative, some of the hopeful alternative way. I know it won't solve, the existing problem, very fundamentally, but just want to shed light on some of the discussions on that. Yeah, thanks.
So as we wrap up this conversation, the goal, I would think, looking at it from Taiwan's perspective, are twofold. One, obviously, is to ensure its own economic security and to ensure its position in the critical mineral supply chain. But I also believe that another one is a geopolitical strategy as well. And we talked about the unique status of Taiwan and how this could actually enhance the visibility of some of Taiwan's vulnerabilities on the international political stage. What would be the most ideal outcome, regardless of who wins the US presidential elections? What kind of relationship should Taiwan seek with the United States to ensure that its place in the critical mineral supply chain is secured, and also hopefully lead it to elevate its position on the international political stage as well?
I think it would be the continuous efforts between, Taiwan and the like-minded partners and countries that would serve as the foundation to it. Because, geopolitical wise, it's like shifting all the time. But I guess by presenting Taiwan as a very trusted partner, to the like-minded partners and countries, I think that would be a good standing point to keep this foundation working, no matter how the domestic politics in the US or elsewhere, pans out. So
Shihoko, I'd love to add something here, which is that as we look forward, I think the greatest opportunity that exists for Taiwan and the United States in this particular space is for Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, and for Taiwanese businesses to be looking at investing in that critical part of the supply chain, which is the processing and refining, and working with allies to say, okay, we may not be able to do this in Taiwan, we may not be able to do it in the United States, but can we do this somewhere else? Can we look for locations that are just simply not China? And can we do it at a cost which makes it competitive as much as possible? Because once you do that, once you diversify that critical choke point of the supply chain, so many more things become possible. And, it's so glaringly obvious in the critical mineral supply chain in general. But here, when you've got a small number of critical minerals that you need to have at a particular quality, at a high level of purity, this is something that should be, it shouldn't be too difficult to do if you get the right stakeholders around the table, and if you have support from, the government of the United States, the government of Taiwan, and other allied countries. And finding those locations will be great, not just for the semiconductor industry. It'll be great for so many countries that produce these basic commodities. As I've heard so many times from Latin American countries, they say, we want the United States to get into the critical minerals game in terms of processing and refining, because it gives us somebody else that we can sell our product to. Right now, we get to sell to the Chinese. And, it's kind of, it's kind of like what people say about big box stores. The providers, when they say the only thing worse than selling to these big box stores is not selling to them, because, that's our only option. In this case, if we provide more diversity, more resilience in the supply chain, then everybody, I think, will benefit here in the United States and in Taiwan.
And I think this identifying where Taiwan's strengths are is key. And I think what we have found out is that Taiwan excels in investing strategically. It excels in providing a very strong, highly educated, motivated workforce. It is committed to precision. And these are elements that could not just benefit Taiwan, but indeed the entire supply chain as well. So with that, I would like to thank Linda again for being part of the Wilson Center community this summer. Thank you for contributing a very eye-opening paper that has contributed a great deal to the conversation here in Washington. I hope that you will continue to share your research with us. Your paper is available online on the Wilson Center website. The link will be posted below this video recording. And thank you, Duncan, for sharing your insight. It's always great to see you. And to you who have joined us today, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again on another occasion.
This video was produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. If you'd like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. There you'll find in-depth discussions and research on important global issues and topics. And thanks for watching.